Welcome to the Need to Know podcast from the Wilson Center, a podcast for policymakers available to everyone. Always informative, nonpartisan, and relevant, we go beyond the headlines to understand the trend lines in foreign policy. Welcome back to another episode of Need to Know. I'm your host, John Milewski. Need to Know is brought to you by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The center is congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and fiercely nonpartisan. And this week, we present the second in a series of virtual briefings for the new Congress and administration, this time with a focus on Mexico. My guest is the director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute, Lila Abed. Lila, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
John, it's a pleasure to join you.
So, Lila, before we dig into some specifics, let's begin with just a general overview of the status of relations between the United States and its southern neighbor, Mexico. We had a high point, a low point. Where do we stand?
Yeah, I mean, there's no relationship, no other bilateral relationship around the world that impacts the millions of lives of citizens living on both sides of the border like the U.S.-Mexico relationship. I mean, the U.S. and Mexico are bound by deep geographical, economic, and cultural ties. They have celebrated more than 200 years of diplomatic relations. And 2024 is a critical juncture for both countries as they both held presidential elections. Their electoral cycles coincide every 12 years, and that was true this year. And so with new governments on both sides of the border, it really presents an opportunity for the new governments to analyze past efforts and to propose new policy options and joint objectives on the bilateral agenda going forward.
Donald Trump ran on tariffs, and he's been rattling that saber as he prepares to be sworn in for a second term. How is Mexico reacting? Give us the overview to the idea that Trump may impose these stiff tariffs on both Mexico, Canada, and others.
It should not be a surprise that President-elect Donald Trump announced a 25% tariff on all Mexican imports, given that we've seen this story before, John. In fact, in 2019, during his first term, then President Trump announced or at least threatened escalating tariffs on its southern neighbor if then President López Obrador didn't do more to stem the flow of undocumented migrants towards the U.S.-Mexico border. And this led to a very clear and strong reaction on behalf of the Mexican government. President López Obrador deployed thousands of members of its National Guard to both of its borders, which led to a steep decline in encounters and detentions at the U.S. southern border. And so this time around, the announcements of tariffs are more linked to security issues, particularly fentanyl and reducing the flow of fentanyl into the United States, which, as we know, has caused a public health crisis of more than 100,000 deaths because of overdose. 70% of those last year were tied to fentanyl overdose. And so synthetic opioids is definitely something that's at the forefront of the bilateral agenda. And this all comes back to tariffs. The initial response of the Mexican government was came from the Minister of the Economy, who said that Mexico was positioned to impose retaliatory tariffs if the U.S. government, the incoming administration, decided to do so on Mexican imports. Since then, we've sort of seen a more softened reaction on behalf of Mexico's new president, that's first female president, Claudia Sheinbaum. She held a call with President-elect Trump in which, according to several tweets and messages that came in the aftermath of this call, seemed like they were able to discuss what Mexico is doing to combat organized crime, to reduce the production and distribution of fentanyl, both in Mexico, but also towards the United States. And so I think that we're seeing things sort of moving along in terms of the future of the U.S.-Mexico relationship and sort of the main aspects that will be talked about and discussed once Trump takes office on January 20th.
You mentioned that Claudia Sheinbaum and Donald Trump had a conversation, and Sheinbaum also had a very pointed response to this notion that the U.S. or Mexico is the problem when it comes to fentanyl, where she suggested the market that the U.S. presents creates chaos in Mexico. How did that go down?
I don't believe that the right sort of strategy going forward for the Mexican government is sort of a tit for tat, sort of placing blame on the United States for the demand. None of this is a lie, and all of this is true. But I believe that, Mexico and the United States have mutual challenges, and the only way that they can really resolve some of the major, really complex issues on the bilateral relationship is by working together. And so whether it's on trade, migration, or security, if one plays the blame game, I think we're going to have some shortcomings in terms of deliverables and clear results. And I think the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, has made it very clear what they expect from the Mexican government going forward. And hopefully Mexico has sort of a grand strategy to offer President Trump and the US in terms of what it is able to deliver. And I think we've had an initial taste of what that can look like. In the last week, we've seen how Security Secretary Omar Garcia Harfuch has sort of been pushing along aggressive efforts in Sinaloa. He notified and shared a message that he was able to confiscate thousands of fentanyl pills, one of the biggest sort of operatives that has happened in recent years in Mexico. And so we're seeing, right, clear actions coming from Mexico since the announcement of tariffs, which hopefully will lead to a more positive outcome in the years ahead.
Is there any existing relationship between Sheinbaum and Trump? Do they have any compatibility, anything that we know about that?
So interestingly enough, there isn't. There isn't past history between President-elect Trump and now President Claudia Sheinbaum. She's never really had to deal with him directly. That said, she does speak fluent English, and my understanding is that she held the call in English, which obviously breaks down that, language barriers, and you don't have the need for a translator, which allows them to sort of, have a more fluid and hopefully closer conversation. That said, Claudia Sheinbaum is completely different ideologically. She's a staunch leftist and a real leftist in the Latin American sense, right? She has been really involved with the leftist movement in Mexico since a young age. But, she does have some qualities that might help her establish a good relationship with President Trump. She studied in the United States. She's lived in the United States. She's worked for a UN panel. And so she has ample experience in the United States. And hopefully that will allow her to establish better communications channels with her U.S. counterpart, and hopefully will allow her government to achieve, better results as soon as Trump is in office.
What about her relationships on Capitol Hill, Lila? Does she have any existing relationships with members of Congress?
I think one of the missed opportunities that Claudia Sheinbaum had when she was candidate was that she failed to make a trip to Washington, right? The opposition leader who was running against her did come to Washington, did have meetings with think tanks, with government officials, with members of Congress. And so I think that was a missed opportunity to allow members of Congress, for USG officials to get a better understanding of sort of her objectives, her government agenda, and to understand her personally. That said, she hasn't come to Washington since taking office. Hopefully she will do so in the beginning of next year. But no, I don't suspect that there are clear ties or clear relationships that she's established with the U.S. legislative branch. That said, I do think that several of her cabinet members do have close ties with members of Congress and have worked with, Trump during his first administration. And so that hopefully will allow her to quickly establish relationships with folks that will be very much involved in U.S.-Mexico matters.
See, if only she would have accepted your invitation to come speak at the Wilson Center. I know that was one of the opportunities that she had. So another issue that looms large, Lila, is the threat of mass deportations. And Mexico already has suggested, right, don't send everybody back to Mexico, send them to their countries of origin. What are the prospects for how this is going to play out between the two neighbors?
So President Sheinbaum has recently announced that she's seeking to land an agreement with the incoming Trump administration in terms of what those mass deportations are going to look like for Mexico. Currently in the United States, there's an estimated 11.3 undocumented migrants residing in the country. About 5.3 million of those are Mexican. And so if we're really thinking about mass deportations, the understanding is that the Trump administration will begin with undocumented migrants that have criminal backgrounds. But one can you sort of suppose or understand that the next tranche of undocumented migrants that will be deported are going to naturally be Mexican. And so I think, President Sheinbaum and the Mexican government are trying to develop a strategy of how they're going to what they call repatriate some of their nationals from the United States to Mexico. I think it will take a lot of resources, which are very scarce currently for the Sheinbaum administration. And so I think a clear deal will have to be hopefully established between the U.S. and Mexico. But one can also, just looking back at sort of the past efforts of the first Trump administration with the Remain in Mexico policy, with Title 42 and other kind of efforts, I do think that if Mexico doesn't offer a clear strategy for, absorbing millions of undocumented migrants quickly, then some of these more aggressive and draconian migration strategies may be imposed on Mexico unilaterally by the United States.
We, for obvious reasons, tend to look at this relationship from the U.S. perspective here in D.C. and at the Wilson Center. What about from the other perspective? How does Mexico view the U.S. currently? And was there a lot of interest in the U.S. election? Is there any reaction that you can report on? What can you tell us in that regard?
So there is no other country that is more important for Mexico than the United States. Mexico is now the U.S.'s top trading partner. It positioned itself as so in 2023 with two-way trade totaling just shy of $800 billion. So Mexico surpassed both China and Canada. We have a USMCA that entered into force on July 1st, 2020, and has increased the trade of goods and services by 50%. It has increased investment in the region by 136%. And so trade is the most fundamental aspect for Mexico in terms of its relationship with the United States. Ahead of the 2026 USMCA review, which has become much more complicated than one would have expected initially, Mexico is really trying to do whatever it needs to do to make sure that the USMCA remains intact and that, it is able to meet the incoming administration's objectives with Mexico so that their trade relationship remains as it is now with the United States. I think one of the main aspects within the trade umbrella for Mexico's government is that they've received a clear indication from Washington that China's growing influence, presence, and investment in Mexico is a national security concern for the United States. It's something that both Democrats and Republicans agree on. And so they are going to be working and already have been working on trying to monitor foreign direct investment in Mexico from China. And I do believe that we're going to see some decoupling efforts in terms of the increasing amount of investment that we've seen from China coming into Mexico in recent years. So I think Mexico understands the importance of the United States. I think they're doing what is necessary and taking the actions that have been asked by the Trump team. And hopefully this will strengthen trade relations going forward. And of course, naturally today, even though in the past trade, security, and migration have sort of been buckets on their own, today all three issues sort of naturally intersect. And so one issue naturally has an effect on another. And so that's something that Sheinbaum's administration will have to grapple with.
Lila, I have a final question for you about sort of the low-hanging fruit, for lack of a better term. We've talked about a lot of the sticky wickets, really, the really tough issues that are going to be ongoing and won't begin and end with one administration, right? These are issues that these two countries are going to grapple with for a long, long time. But is there any low-hanging fruit that this U.S. administration or this U.S. Congress can look to really get off to a good start in building even better relations with Mexico? When I asked this question to our colleague Robert Daly last week in the context of a China briefing, it was a flat out no. There was no low-hanging fruit between China and the U.S. Is there any good news in regards to the U.S. and Mexico?
Listen, John, I actually am hopeful, although perhaps I should say cautiously optimistic, that Claudia Sheinbaum's new security strategy does offer an opportunity to strengthen U.S.-Mexico security cooperation. Very different than her predecessor, and that's not to say that her security strategy doesn't involve some of the efforts of former President Lopez Obrador, but she really has emphasized the need to strengthen investigation and intelligence capabilities to have better coordination at all levels of government in terms of security efforts. And that has allowed, even though they don't say it publicly, it has allowed for some optimism from U.S. security agencies that have seen a real deterioration in cooperation with their Mexican counterparts during the last 6 years. And so I do believe that both Sheinbaum's security strategy, also her cabinet pick to lead the security efforts, who's going to coordinate not only the public security secretary, but will also coordinate the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of the Marines and all agencies involved in security issues in Mexico. Omar Garcia Harfuch will deliver very clear results and will be able to cooperate more closely with U.S. counterparts. And I think this is incredibly needed given the decline in cooperation that I mentioned. And all of this will have to start by reestablishing, rebuilding mutual trust between security agencies on both sides of the border and establishing what the shared objectives are between both countries. I think that is fundamental going forward, but I do believe that there's some glimmer of hope in terms of the future of U.S.-Mexico security cooperation.
Lila, thank you. You know, I think it's human nature, and it's certainly part of politics, is we tend to focus on problems. And I always find it refreshing that you remind us about all the things that work in this relationship and how important it is to both countries. So thank you, and thanks to you and your colleagues for your ongoing work. I want to tell our listeners and viewers, if you're interested in learning more, you can visit wilsoncenter.org. And if you use the Programs tab at the top of the homepage, that's where you can find Lila and her colleagues in the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute and all their ongoing work. We'll be back with another episode of Need to Know soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for your time and interest.